Hi guys, this is Jen Curtis, pre and postnatal fitness specialist based in and around Tel Aviv. I've made a few videos in the past on Diastasis Recti, and I just want to kind of create an update. And at some point I'll probably redo the video that I made on how to assess for diastasis. It hasn't changed an awful lot, but I would want to add to that a couple of things. So I'll talk about that now, but I'll create that video at some point. But so a question that I get asked a lot is but what exercises are good for fixing diastasis? And it's a question that I always struggle with, because if it was as simple as, okay, you need to do these 3 exercises and it will fix it, like, I wouldn't have a job. It wouldn't be necessary to talk in so much depth about all of this stuff. Although it would be so nice to have this really, one size fits all approach, it doesn't really work like that. And if you look online, if you Google it, if you look on YouTube, there's loads of people who'll be like 3 simple exercises to fix your DR or whatever. And it's just not as simple as that. It just doesn't work like that. And I'm going to talk about why. It seems like a sensible enough question. Like, can you give me some exercises to fix an abdominal separation? But it shows an underlying misunderstanding about what diastasis is and what and how it affects the tissues, and what we need to do as trainers or physios or whatever to help rectify and heal the issue. I often get the impression that people think that I can just go, okay, do this exercise and this exercise and this exercise, and like, there's so much that I need to know that sometimes people ask me for a friend or for a trainee, like, how I have this person who, like, how do I fix their DR? And it's like, well, I don't know anything about this person. I don't know how, if I have, to understand my process, if I had someone come in, the way that I work is I have people come in for an initial consultation. It's an hour and a quarter, and if diastasis recti is the main issue, most of the session will be focused around that and on assessing what's happening with the diastasis. So before I want to talk about a few of the factors involved, and what I'm looking for, and then how the main takeaway that I want you to get from this video is that in every single case it would be different. So I would do an assessment where I look at a lot of different things, and then I would try to put together I would try a bunch of different exercises that I think, based on the way that I know anatomy and the tissues work, and based on my previous experience, I'll put together a bunch of I'll kind of try a bunch of different exercises, and each exercise I try, I will be feeling the tummy, like palpating the tummy and checking and cueing and seeing if it's possible to do it without it's to see that if it's the right exercise or if it's something that's going to be helpful or harmful. But my assessment is a lot more than just the tissue. So let's talk about what that assessment looks like. The first thing I would do is I would check for the diastasis in that, like, supine position, so the person lying on their back, that traditional kind of crunch type assessment where you actually put your fingers on the linea alba and test to see how deep the gap is, how wide the gap is, if it's like, different depths and different widths along the length of the linea alba. how soft it is, or how firm it is, how much the muscles are contracting. You get a lot of information from just doing this really basic assessment, but often it's not really it only really tests spinal flexion. So it's not it doesn't necessarily give us all the information that we need to do a proper assessment, to have a full assessment. It gives us one snapshot of how the tissues respond to a certain movement and a certain stress and a certain contraction, but it doesn't give us the whole picture. We have to do a lot more. So then the next thing I would do is I would have that same test with the little head raise, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, check out my previous video on that test because it gives you most of the information. I would then cue that same test with a pelvic floor contraction, which my preferred way of working is that that trainee would have been to see a pelvic floor physio who's taught them how to do a proper pelvic floor contraction, because I can't assess that properly. I can't do an internal exam and check that those muscles are actually contracting as they should. So I would then have them redo the test, but with a pelvic floor contraction, because a pelvic floor contraction creates a co-contraction in the transverse abdominis, and will change. It is oftentimes, so what we're looking for there is a change in the way that the tissues respond when you do that little curl up. And if they don't respond to a pelvic floor contraction, the person either isn't doing a pelvic floor contraction, or there's a problem with the timing between pelvic floor, and like there should be a co-contraction there. So that would be a sign to me that that person needs to go and see a pelvic floor physio and address that that situation. You can also cue a kind of transverse contraction and see if it changes the way the muscles and the linea alba responds. Now the linea alba can respond in different ways as well. The classic kind of thing that people think of is that you can put your fingers in through the linea alba, or not through, but that there's not much tension in the linea alba, so you can kind of, get quite deep into the, you test how deep you can go, whether it's like a knuckle or 2 knuckles, or and how many fingers you can do that with. That would be one, but sometimes that's not the case, and sometimes the linea alba bulges outwards when the person does a roll up. So there's lots of information that we can gather from this initial test, but it is just one test. Oftentimes I've had women who it seems fine in that, and then as soon as you get them to do something else, they bulge, and they bulge in different things, and in different ways. Sometimes the whole rectus abdominis will sort of bulge forward, and it's not so much like pressure coming through the linea alba, but it's more like all of the rectus abdominis is bulging forward. So there are different bits of information that we can pick up from this little test. Before I move on to any actual exercises, I would first of all check the person's posture. This is really important because often women are, their rib cages are translated back. Julie Wiebe talks a lot about this, that it looks like a lumbar lordosis, but it's actually just a translation back posteriorly of the rib cage, and it's kind of slanted at an angle, and quite often the mum is tucked in the pelvis and not in a big anterior pelvic tilt rather than in a posterior pelvic tilt. So it creates the illusion of a lordosis. But anyway, there's lots of different variations on this theme. I'll talk more about that specifically in a different post, but just know that a massive lumbar lordosis, or the illusion of one, where the rib cage is thrown back, is going to create more pressure forward on the abdomen. I know that if I lean back and don't engage my core properly, then I bulge my linea out through the whole rectus abdominis bulges forward. So this creates a lot of unnecessary strain on those tissues, and we'd need to address that kind of posture. If that woman's stuck in, there's no such thing as bad posture, but if that woman's stuck in that particular posture and can't get out of it, then that can be problematic, and we need to address that. And that could also be causing or contributing to the diastasis. It's really important to fix that and to get her in good alignment, especially when she's working out. Now, the third thing I would test is breathing. I would check that she has the piston breath, again from Julie Wiebe, set up nicely. I'll talk about that in greater depth in a different video. And I'd also want to check that she's not bearing down with her diaphragm. I have had some women who, you know, when they on the exhale, they bear down, their diaphragm locks and kind of spasms and pushes down. This creates lots of intra-abdominal pressure and creates a bulge. And when we fix that, I have had a couple of cases where we've just fixed that, and that seemed to be the main issue or the main cause of it, because as soon as we fixed that, the diastasis has started to improve without really doing anything else. So that's really important to address. It doesn't always have such dramatic changes for different people, but you can start to see how complex of a picture this really is. Sometimes the posture is what's really going to help someone. Sometimes the breathing is really going to help someone. Sometimes I've also had women who we've worked on their diastasis for ages and ages and ages and ages and ages, and things haven't really improved, and then they go to see a pelvic floor physio. It turns out their pelvic floor is weak. They strengthen that up, and all of a sudden everything works way better, and their back pain gets better, and their diastasis gets better. So sometimes it's just like it's a bit of a puzzle, and you just need to kind of figure it out, and you're just trying to look for clues and trying to see what you can change to create some change in the person. Then finally, that's when I would get on to different exercises, and I have a whole bunch of like no crunch core exercises on my YouTube channel. It's just a kind of selection, and it's so hard to say what exercises are good for diastasis, because again, it's going to differ so much from person to person. It's going to differ so much depending on how they're bulging, if they're bulging. Some women will have quite a deep diastasis, for example, but there's no bulging. When they do a crunch, their tummy stays flat, but there's still a big a big kind of, you can get your fingers in to the gap between the two sides of the rectus abdominis, like quite deep. Whereas another woman will do that kind of crunch, and the intra-abdominal pressure will leak out through the linea alba. So there are lots of different ways that it can manifest itself and that the tissues can react to each individual exercise. Now, when it comes to core exercises, the way that I like to approach it is that everyone always thinks of the kind of concentric movements when it comes to core work. And what I mean by that is the movement. So they think of crunches, which is spinal flexion. They think about the side flexion, doing lots of those. And it usually ends there. But again, I can go into this in more depth in another post, but what I want you to understand is that there are 4 possible movements of the spine. One is flexion, which is like doing a crunch. One is extension, which is like leaning back, bending your back backwards. The third is side flexion, so leaning sideways. And the fourth is rotation. Now, in general, what I've come across, and this is a very general statement, but some of the best exercises for training the core postpartum are actually not in any of those categories. Sometimes they are, and again, it depends on the individual, but some of the best exercises are actually don't involve movement. They're resisting movement, and they're isometric contractions. So that means they're often referred to as anti-flexion, anti-extension, anti-rotation, and anti-side flexion. So if I am holding a plank, for example, gravity is pulling my hips down towards the floor, and I have to resist that movement. So gravity is trying to pull me into spinal extension, which would mean my back is bending backwards, and I'm trying to resist that movement. So that would be an example of an anti-extension movement. There aren't many examples of rather than flexion, I tend to prefer anti-extension, and that's not always the case, but as a general rule of thumb, and especially when and also not all anti-extension exercises are created equal. So I have a plank is really quite a challenging anti-extension movement. But if you take just a heel slide where you just lie on your back and you slide one leg out and then you slide the other leg and you put it back and you slide the other leg out, that's a really gentle anti-extension movement. There's a very slight force pulling us into extension, which would be like our backs arching off the floor, and we have to resist that. So that is usually like the most gentle exercise that I would start with for most women postpartum who have quite a severe diastasis, or it might be something that you can start doing, you know, in the first week postpartum, or, you know, very early on if you don't have any major issues. And then there's everything in between. So a dead bug is another very challenging anti-extension movement. These you can all find on my YouTube channel, so just look for them. A pullover with a heel slide is also an anti-extension exercise, slightly more challenging, and brings in some back muscles. This extension of the shoulder joint, so uses latissimus dorsi and obviously other accessory muscles there. And then a Pallof press is a really great example of an anti-rotation exercise. So the external force is pulling me into rotation and I have to resist that. A side plank is a really great example of an anti-side flexion movement. I could go on and on. This is often a really difficult concept for people to get their heads around. But I think my most important message here is that there is no one size fits all when it comes to finding the right exercises to heal a specific person's DR. If you're a trainer and you want to help someone heal their DR, or if you have a DR yourself and you want to fix it, my biggest piece of advice to you is to try different exercises and feel your tummy, feel what's happening with the muscles. Are they bulging? Is there pressure coming through the linea alba? Quite often, especially with very sporty women, I find that there's a separation in the upper part of the abs and not on the lower part. So they'll be fine on the lower abs and everyone checks that, but then they're actually leaking pressure through the upper abdominals, and that's going to be getting is likely to be getting worse. I had a really extreme case recently. This really fit, really sporty woman who she could do everything. She could do planks, she could do side planks, she could do all the really, really challenging stuff. And then I got her to just do a tiny crunch or to just do a heel slide, and she was really struggling. It was really hard for her to not bulge through the top of her, the superior part of her abs, the bit above the belly button, the top third, and that's really unusual that you can contain the pressure in all these other movements, these more challenging movements, but in the in the less challenging ones you bulge. But it is something that happens. So specifically for her, she could work on planks and she could do things like that. She wasn't bulging, but then I had to get her doing some really gentle heel slides in order, and anything more with more spinal flexion than that, like any kind of crunching or anything with more resistance, like having her legs up at 90 degrees while she's lying on her back, she would bulge. So you just can't, you've got to build up towards that. But that's that's the biggest takeaway here, is it's all about individualization. Who is this person? Get them in front of you. Try some different things. First of all, go through your normal diastasis check on their back, but then you also need to go through posture. You need to go through breathing and see if there are any problems there and troubleshoot there. You then need to do some functional tests. Does she bulge when she's squatting? Does she bulge when she's deadlifting? Does she bulge when she's hanging off of a bar? Does she bulge when she's crunching up? Does she bulge when she's doing a plank? Does she bulge on all fours? Like, you need to test her in all of these possible scenarios and say, and kind of have a list written out and say, okay, you can do that one, you can do that one, you can do that one. Try to avoid this one for now. And then let's think about what mimics that movement that you can't do, what mimics that movement that's easier, and how can we get you doing that and then building you up to something that's more challenging. How can we find a similar way of challenging those muscles, or a similar kind of movement that will bridge the gap to the more challenging movement? And unfortunately, when someone comes to me and says, hi, I had a baby 3 months ago and I have a diastasis, what exercises should I do? Hopefully you can see now how little information that is and how little I can actually help that person. And it's not a case of me just, wanting to get someone in for a session unnecessarily or withholding information. It's just that it's so much more complicated than that. If she's, and you see this in Pilates classes where women, flock into, there's like 30 women in a Pilates class and they're doing great exercises, like all the exercises, there's nothing wrong with any of the exercises, but for that specific person, it's not good. And they're bulging. You see a lot of bulging, you see a lot of breath holding and a lot of struggling to hold certain positions. And that's not good. That's not going to heal the tissues. So I want you to start to be aware of all the different factors, all the different ways that diastasis can look very different from one person to another. It can react very, very differently to different movements and to different movement patterns. And it's impossible. What will be ridiculously easy for one person will be very, very, very challenging for someone else, and vice versa. And you've got to, if you're not assessing the tissues in every single movement that you're prescribing, I don't think that I think you could be putting yourself or the person at risk of doing things that could potentially cause more damage. Again, we don't know if it causes more damage, but from previous experience of women who've done a lot of the wrong things, and it's kind of gotten worse. So I hope that it's a very difficult topic to explain, and I put a lot of information into these last 23 minutes, and hopefully I'll have time to make some separate videos that breaks those things down a little bit more. But I hope that starts to paint a picture of how complicated this is, and how it's not just a one-size-fits-all thing. So let me know what you think of that. Let me know if you understood, if you are totally confused and have no idea what I'm talking about. Let me know if you made it to the end. If you do like this video, please give it a like, because it helps it get ranked, and the information it helps it get ranked better on YouTube, and the information to get to more women. Please share it with a woman that you think it may help. And any questions or comments, please write below. And subscribe to my channel if you've got if you'd like to know more about pregnancy and postpartum fitness. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope you made it this far. See you next time. Bye.